Sahana bhavatu, sahano bhunattu, sahaviryam karavavahai, tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaskar. Good evening to all invited guests, dignitaries and participants. On behalf of Modak Academy, myself Pritili Modak, your host for this beautiful evening, and I am really delightful that you are giving your valuable time to this webinar. Today's deliberation, the problem of semantics in contemporary cognitive science and its Indian resonance, presented by Professor Sreekala M. Nair. Professor Sreekala M. Nair is Senior Professor and Head, Department of Philosophy, Sree Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kalady. She is also Director, International School of Sree Sankara Studies and former Professor, Nalanda University. She has acquired her PhD from University of Madras on Contemporary Epistemology in 1994 and joined Sankaracharya University in the same year and has been working in this university since then. Her areas of specializations are contemporary epistemological issues, contemporary analytic metaphysics, epistemic logic, Indian epistemology, consciousness study, Indian, cultural studies, Indian aesthetic. She is a member of ICPR, the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, New Delhi. She has authored some books, edited 2 books, and published around 50 research papers in journals and compiled volumes. With great respect and excitement, I welcome Professor Sreekala M. Nair to take the virtual stage. Thank you.
Am I to start?
Yes.
Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Thank you, young friend, for profusely introducing me to the august audience here. I have a brief acquaintance with the Modak Trainer Academy. It was for the first time that I spoke in this forum, I remember, during the obituary of Professor J.L. Shaw. And I'm extremely grateful to the organizers to have invited me to deliver this talk in this forum. I learned that this is a monthly study circle where scholars make their presentations. I suppose that is the case. There are monthly study circles. All right. So this evening, I have a very ambitious project. I did not know whether I'll be able to do full justice to what I have in mind. Often I tell my students that I speak for myself. I'm the first listener. And once the presentation is done, then it is for me, and I will know exactly how good I spoke. So from that aspect, from the aspect of the self, I do not know whether I'll be able to do justice to the huge project that I have conceived, but let's make a try. As you by now know, the title of my presentation would be The Problem of Semantics in Contemporary Cognitive Science and its Indian Resonances. Meanwhile, let me just try Perfect. So sorry for that initial glitches. So here we go. As you know, the title of the presentation is The Problem of Semantics in Contemporary Cognitive Science and its Indian Resonances. So friends, let me make a quick introduction to cognitive science and its state of art. Cognitive science has undergone significant paradigm shifts since it emerged as an independent discipline. The major among them being the transition from the computational theory of cognition to an embodied framework. I suppose this is known to all. So this transition is the result of a profound rethinking of how the mind is understood, whether it is an independent entity that is solely responsible for our cognitive processes, or as something that is related to the body and the immediate environment surrounding it as well. With this transition from the computational model to the embodied model, we are overriding the mind-body dualism that pervaded philosophy since Descartes. The ongoing research in cognitive science found both these models, that is, both the computational as well as the embodied models, inappropriate to account for the complex and the intriguing cognitive mechanism functional in humans, thus giving rise to a parallel model, or rather models, that try to retain the strengths of these two models and at the same time overcome their shortcomings. And there are a couple of them. The major one is Ray Jacondov's conceptual semantics model. The present paper focuses on how semantics is accounted for in the changing models of cognition, both in the computational, the embodied, and also Jacondov's model of conceptual semantics, and to see how Jacondov accommodates semantics in his theory of conceptual semantics. The paper will also raise some interesting parallels from Indian philosophy if time permits. The computational theory of mind was committed to three major principles. First, that the information conveyed by a mental representation is autonomous and is non-dependent on the sensory motor system. This is the major idea of the computational theory. Second, knowledge is represented prepositionally, and meaning emerges from the relations among the constituent symbols. And third, the internal representations instruct the motor system, which is essentially separate and independent of cognition. So learn that in the computational model, it was fully algorithmic, and there was no interaction that was supposed between the internal organism or the inner mechanism and the sensory motor organs. So this model, with its major proponents like Putnam, Chomsky, Fodor, and others, conceptualized mind quite like a computer, where cognitive processes are operated through the symbolic manipulation of internal representations. However, the dominance of this computational approach came under scrutiny during the last few decades. While computational theories argued that symbolic processing best captured the essence of cognition, remember, they struggled to explain how such capabilities emerged in the cognitive system after all, and where these symbolic representations are resided or placed within the brain. This is called the symbol grounding problem. And this further highlighted the difficulty in explaining how symbols acquired meaning. So the computational model had to confront two major problems. One was the symbol grounding problem, where these symbols are grounded. And second, how these symbols acquired meaning. Now, this discontent to the computational format led to the transition from the former to an embodied theory. This perspective, that is the embodied theory, placed the body at the core of the cognitive processes and argued that cognition arises from the dynamic interaction between organisms and their physical and cultural environments, incorporating emotional responses and transformative actions as integral to our experience. As you all know, the embodied theorists conceived that body and the immediate environment has a lot to say, or rather has the major role to play in our cognition. Research in sensory motor systems demonstrates that perception and action are dynamically coupled, challenging the notion of cognition as the product of abstract computation. So this research, the ongoing research in cognition also has shown green signal to the embodied theorists, saying that it is not the case. The real cognition, the real world cognition doesn't follow the computational format. Let's see now how this transition reflects in constituting meaning in language, because our problem is semantics. The embodied theorists outrightly rejected words as having an intrinsic meaning. Instead, they focused on the process of understanding and were concerned about how words enabled us to perform an action. Meaning here is not considered as something that is given, as in the computational process. Because you know that in the computational model, the meaning is something which is given innate. But here in the embodied, the meaning is something which is acquired through our action and engagement with the body and the environment. And as so, meaning here is not considered as something that is given, but as that which is created in the process of how we use and respond to linguistic cues. According to Andrew Wilson and Sabrina Golanka, such a non-representational alternative is a non-linear dynamical system integrating body and environment. So friends, a non-representational alternative was placed in forefront as in the contemporary cognitive linguistics. Strong embodied theories argue for a direct role of sensory motor areas in language comprehension. However, more recent research, such as that of the Cameron, suggests that the motor system may not be as crucial as previously thought. Subsequently, the later research is also somehow told us that it is not the case, as the embodied theorists would say, that motor system has a direct say in constructing meaning. A commonsensical question often bombarded at the embodied theorists. It's not the case that embodied theory is a happy ending story. There were several issues that are found with embodied theory of cognition as well. The major one is the irony involved in a situation when a damage to a particular sensory or motor organ does not always cause conceptual loss associated with that area. Though you do not have, even if your arm is amputated, still you have the cognition of that preserved in your brain. In brief, while the embodied cognition paradigm offers promising avenues for understanding mind and behavior, because it makes the body and the environment involved in the process of cognition, it suffers from two main weaknesses: vice, the insufficiency, and the incompleteness. The embodied theory is insufficient because it does not provide a full explanation of the concepts to which they apply. And they also appear incomplete because they do not seem to capture all that is encased in the abstract concepts. These limitations have driven cognitive scientists to look for an integrated theory where elements from these two models make it combined, because there are insights engraved in both these models. We need the virtues of both the computational as well as the embodied theory. So those who attempted on the integrated theory wanted to preserve the merits of both these theory and then want to forego their shortcomings. Among a couple of such models, we shall explore Ray Jackanoff's conceptual semantics today. Ray Jacanoff, a student of Chomsky, developed conceptual semantics in order to address the limitations in generative grammar of Chomsky. He believed that meaning is not just how words corresponded to objects in the world, as the representationalists argued. Rather, it is about how these words are related to the mental representations that it generated. In brief, we need a theory that could explain how linguistic expressions correspond to the way humans perceive, think about, and interact with the world. Language isn't just about the words we use or the rules that govern sentence structure. It's not that grammar has to guide us always, but something deeply tied to how we think, how we react, how we respond, how we perceive the world, and how we form mental representations of our experiences. Ray Jacanoff's theory of conceptual semantics aligns with the move toward an integrated view of cognition where language and thought are both computationally structured and embodied in interaction with the world, thus incorporating the virtues of both these theories. He defines word meanings as states within a subsystem of the brain's combinatorial system called conceptual structures, which may exist either in the form of symbols or a system of neurons. He doesn't specify that. The resources available within the brain, which he calls as the conceptual well-formedness rules, is what determines the space for conceptual structures within the brain. I'll speak more about it. So he speaks about what is called the conceptual well-formedness rules, which determines all that conceptual structures and transactions that is made possible. All that has to happen within that. And the entire set of concepts that a human being can possibly attain is determined by the combinatorial principles of these conceptual well-formedness rules. Now, this is a pictorial representation of the conceptual semantics. As you see, at the forefront, you have the conceptual well-formedness rules, and followed with that, you have there is an interaction that is happening between the conceptual structures and the linguistic structures being influenced by perception and action and being guided by inference rules. So there is both the way interaction. Inference rule constitutes or guides conceptual structures as well as vice versa. Now, conceptual structures are interrelated, which in fact allow us, as I have just said, they are interrelated, which allow us to proceed from one concept to another during a cognitive episode. And this is precisely what happens in our live cognitions. These concepts are governed by the rules of inference, those that allow the brain to make logical connections between concepts. Additionally, these conceptual structures are tied to linguistic representations through rules of correspondence, thereby ensuring that concepts can be expressed in language. Similarly, they're linked to perception and action as well, allowing perceptual experience to be encoded in a form that is suitable for linguistic expression. Remember, Jackson was vowed to adopt the virtues of embodied theory as well. So there is an interaction that is happening between the conceptual structures in the brain as well as the body and the environment. It is this relation between perceptual experiences and conceptual structures that enables Jackson to account for the smooth transition from concrete experiences to abstract thoughts. Thus, conceptual structures serve as an intermediary between perceptual representations and abstract concepts. See, perceptual representations are concrete, while you have the abstract concepts. See, any linguistic theory, any cognitive theory will also have to account for abstract concepts. You all knew that computational theory was excellent in accounting for abstract concepts, and embodied theory was very poor in accounting for abstract concepts. Now, Jackson is trying to bring in the virtues of both these models, and he is trying to account for abstract concepts as well as perceptual representations. For Jackson, a word meaning is a fragment of a conceptual structure that's linked in long-term memory with a phonological structure and a syntactic structure. The words one knows consists of stored concepts linked with stored elements of linguistic expression. I'll speak more about the stored concepts and how the language gets stored. There are a number of factors that contribute to the meaning of a word. For instance, the connection of a word meaning to perception and action, implying that the concept expressed by a word refers to the object that it represents. But by reference here, we are not speaking about a referential theory. Remember, it is a non-referential theory. So by reference, we mean a mental representation, which is linked to the object's perceptual properties and actions that cognition simulates. Words that generate conceptual structures could either be bounded. Now he is trying to speak about how this actually takes place, how the cognition actually takes place in his conceptual semantics, otherwise called as the parallel structure, which we will speak more about it. Because he says there could be words that generate conceptual structures, could either be bounded or complete or unbounded. Take, for instance, the verb approach and reach. They both suggest moving towards the destination. When we say I approach her house or I reach the house, both suggest moving towards the destination. But the former involves an unbounded feature, as one can approach for something and not get it. And the latter indicates that the goal has been attained, suggesting a bounded feature. So one is bounded, approach is unbounded, while reach is bounded. So this way, the difference in verbs and their interaction with the linguistic inference determine how word meanings are shaped in their conceptual features. So this is a conceptual feature, the bounded and the unbounded nature of the word. The position of a word within a broader network of lexical relationship also has a major role to play in defining its meaning. Words exist within a lexicon in a taxonomic hierarchy. For instance, I'll speak about, see, the relationship between a guitar and a musical instrument on one and guitar and stringed instrument on the other. Evidently, the latter is more closer. The message is the narrower the categories, the greater is the understanding of concepts involved in it. So, you can easily define a guitar as a stringed musical instrument rather than just a musical instrument. Of course, guitar can be distinguished from a glass by categorizing it as a musical instrument, but it's easier because it's being narrowed down. The definition or the category is being narrowed down. So this is yet another conceptual structuring. Often in cases where lexical categories are minimum, the available categories tend to fill in their space. Like for example, in the color lexicon. In the color lexicon, you are lost. See, if you are trying to speak to another about the nature of scarlet red, for instance, if she doesn't get it, then you will try to say that it is, a color between chili red and brick red. And you employ all the available categories to bring understanding to the listener. Thus, the structure of the lexicon plays a crucial role in organizing the concepts. Another factor which significantly contributes to word meaning is the grammatical structure of language. Traditionally, we have given great role to grammar. In fact, people like Chomsky has placed grammar at the pedestal. For instance, among the two sentences, look at these two sentences. They fill the jar with water and they fill water into the jar. Apparently, they look the same, but the grammar is different. The first sentence suggests that the jar has been filled completely, whereas the second simply suggests the process of filling water into the jar. The various factors that contribute to shaping one's conceptual structure, like the well-formedness rules, inference rules, etc., link to grammatical expressions and non-linguistic modalities, along with the set of related words in the lexicon, all playing a role in determining word meaning and its use. Granting that the conceptual well-formedness rules are the resources which make it possible for humans to have these conceptual structures, the question of its origin has been a perplexing one. They cannot be learned. See, where do these conceptual structures come from? They cannot be learned as they constitute the very basis for learning. Fodder and his contemporaries considered these conceptual well-formedness rules as innate, a view to which Jackanoff has no major issue. But unlike Fodder, he was not willing to completely rely on innate theory. He believed that the conceptual well-formedness rules act as structures of possibilities to represent the sense data. Do you get it? See, this is the difference between Fodder and Jackanoff. See, Jackanoff is trying to, though, even as he say, or even as he accommodates the innate theory, he is not willing to completely rely on innate theory. And instead, he says that these innate norms or conceptual well-formedness rules act as structures of possibilities, and they are only possibilities. And what make them actualities? The sense data and the actual interaction with the world, with the body, make these possibilities into actualities. And one needs to have associative capacities which can enable them to form complex concepts. True, the potencies have to be necessarily innate. And as you all know, you'll have to observe how children learn languages. And as you all know that children below 4 are open to all languages. And as the child develop single language experience, this innate potency to have access to all languages consistently gets diminished. We know that children are not taught the meanings of all concepts, and this is yet another wonder. And Jackanoff speaks beautifully about it. We know that children are not taught the meanings of all concepts, but they grasp it through their engagement with the physical and the social world. And it's a surprise that children seem to know much more than they have had experience in the world. This also speaks about the innateness fact. According to Jackando, word meanings are not purely innate, but composite, constructed from smaller conceptual primitives and are governed by the principles of combination. Contemporary cognitive linguists like Piaget and Lakoff emphasize that they are cognitive linguists of contemporary times. They emphasize that abstract concepts are constructed, and this construction, even the abstract concepts are constructed, and this construction is deeply tied to the physical and perceptual experiences that individuals have during their development. Jackanow finds this theory problematic. See, for instance, he gives an example. He gives here an example. Look at the two usages of went in these sentences. Lakoff speaks about meaning as a metaphor and all that. So he says he has a distaste for this metaphor theory. He says, for instance, look at the usages of went, the verb went in these two sentences. Bill went to the store, and the other sentence, the inheritance went to Philip. The former, in the former sentence, the verb when suggests a physical motion, while the latter suggesting a transfer of property. They were revealing the abstract concept of ownership. Such an extension, Jackanow points out, is not possible. So he says, what he's trying to say is the proposal of cognitive linguists like Piaget and Lakoff that even abstract concepts are constructed and nothing is innate is a theory that cannot be chewed. Firstly, spatial concepts involve a three-dimensional space, while abstract concepts like possession do not. So, went in that sense, where went has been used metaphorically, cannot be a spatial notion. Similarly, abstract concepts involve abstract features like ownership, which cannot be understood through spatial features. Now, these features, therefore, should be available to the individual. For instance, the notion of ownership should be available to an individual as conceptual primitives in order to enable him to have a conceptual structure of ownership. This is what Jackanow maintains. This does not mean that Jackanow ignores the cultural specificities of various expressions. He is not saying that we are not learning things through culture. In children, for instance, both innate foundations and developmental processes are crucial in the formation of abstract knowledge, thus allowing for a synthesis of the models proposed by the computational and the embodied theories of meaning formation. Now, to speak about the parallel architecture model of J. Rakandov, he says he identifies three core components in any linguistic theory: phonological structure, syntactic structure, and semantic structure, which together help to account for how language function and convey meaning. While phonological structures pertain to how speech sounds are produced, the intonations, the emphasis that is given, etc., organized and patterned, syntactic and semantic structures deal with grammar and meaning, respectively. Parallel architecture model has incorporated a robust semantic theory named conceptual semantics. I'll tell you what parallel architecture model is, which is not only addresses this parallel architecture model, not only addresses limitations of earlier syntactico-centric approaches given, for instance, given by Chomsky, but also aligns with the evidence from cognitive science and biology, emphasizing the autonomy and importance of semantics and phonology in language of thought. In language and thought, it's not the case that syntax alone is supreme. In brief, this model, parallel architecture model, introduces a constraint-based formalism. There is formalism, but it is constraint-based that eliminates the rigid directionality of tree building. The tree, remember the Chomskyan tree building as it is followed in classical models. Instead of algorithmically expanding nodes, this approach uses predefined structural fragments or treelets, which represent pieces of syntactic structure that can be combined in a flexible manner. For instance, structures can be built from top to down, bottom up, or even starting in the middle. The process is governed by constraints, ensuring there are environmental constraints, there are linguistic constraints, there are bodily constraints. So there are various constraints. So the process is governed by constraints, ensuring that the resulting tree form conforms to linguistic rules, regardless of the order in which it is constructed. This approach allows the grammar to function as a system of constraints and is non-directional, meaning there because it gives a free hand, and therefore that is why grammar has been restrained to an extent. It is non-directional, meaning there is no single prescribed sequence for building a grammatical structure as Chomsky conceived. Another notable feature of parallel architecture is the idea of contextual restrictions. Here, words carry inherent requirements for their syntactic and semantic environments. Whether real-time processing of linguistic data happens serially or parallelly is yet another question. Serially has been the classical model. Whether, systematically one by one in an analytic fashion. Or is it that real-time processing of linguistic data happens parallelly? Parallel architecture model has a leaning towards parallel processing. Jackendorf argues that syntactic treelets, which are of similar form as words, generate multiple treelets when an ambiguous statement is uttered. There are multiple treelets being produced or being provided, and only after a combined processing of various components of language can one determine the correct structure and form of it. And with multiple treelets being given, you will confine to the actual, employing all the constraints, and then arrive at the correct form of it. Another issue in language processing literature is regarding working memory and long-term memory. Are they identical or separate? Jackendorf's parallel architecture model conceives working memory as separate from long-term memory. Jackendorf thus poses, because the working memory has to do a lot of structuring, Jackendorf thus poses a linguistic working memory separate from long-term memory and with three departments, one each for the three components of language, viz. Grammar, phonetics, and semantics, which interacts with each other through linkages. This parallel architecture model offers a compelling framework for understanding language processing, favoring a parallel over serial approaches and advocating for a distinct modular working memory. The parallel architecture model also allows for the interplay between linguistic and visual representations as well, emphasizing how different cognitive domains collaborate during real-time language comprehension. Now, let's take a quick look at the limitations of this parallel architecture model of Jackendorf. The rich, interconnected interfaces between syntax, semantics, and phonology of the theory makes it challenging to formalize these interactions. How is it? Jackendorf, says that there is interaction, but how this interaction takes place? How do we formalize that? Second, its reliance on cognitive modularity may not fully explain how these modules evolved, integrated, or adapted for language-specific functions. Further, it assumes a pre-existing modular cognitive architecture, which provides limited insight into how these modules co-evolved with language. He says that it is genetically evolved, so on and so forth, but he doesn't give details of that. Though we have evidences to show that language and cognition co-shape neural pathways, Jackendorf's framework leaves major gaps in accounting for these processes. Since all is not well with the Western theories of cognition and language, it seems wise to take a quick look at the Indian basket to see what it offers. You all know that Mimamsa, Vyakarana, and Bauddha schools of thought have all maintained a non-referential approach to meaning. The Prabhagara school, which is a very interesting school, has argued that a word meaning is not fixed and varies depending on its context within a sentence. This dynamic relationship means that the suggested or the contextual meaning is not a static reference, but emerges from the interplay of words. Very interesting theory indeed. But I'm not going to extend myself to Mimamsa as well because the time will not permit. So I will try to confine myself to Vyakarana and the Bauddha schools of thought, because they seem to have a lot more to share with Jack and off. Now let me focus on the Vyakarana school. Bhartrihari's notion that the essence of meaning is contained as an undifferentiated whole in language can be considered as a framework supporting the conceptual semantics, where the inbuilt potential, both of them speak about the innate theories, where the inbuilt potential for meaning is what resonates with other features to produce the meaning of an expression. Speaking on the innate potencies of language, Jackendorf says, this is a very interesting quote from Jackendorf. Please listen to me. He says, I quote, Jackendorf, to my mind, though, the most compelling evidence comes from transcendental argument that I like to quote as the paradox of language acquisition. He says there is a paradox of language acquisition, and he says this how there is innateness with language. He says the best of the evidence comes from the transcendental, but he's unhappy about this transcendental argument. He says every normal child acquires the mental grammar of his or her own language within 7 or 8 years with little direct instruction or consultation. Yet the community of linguistics working collectively has not succeeded in writing the grammar of a single language, despite decades of research backed by centuries of traditional grammar. Now, this is the wonder. This is the paradox. See, the child seemed to be perfectly having a grasp of the mental grammar, but linguists break their head even to work on a single language. Now, the Vakyabudhiya suggests that language is more than just a tool. It's a cognitive force that shapes our perception of reality. This aligns with the cognitive linguistic principle that our thoughts and understanding are structured by language. Bhartrihari, in fact, goes a step ahead, which is not, of course, which will not be appreciated by the West, and argues that language is deeply connected to consciousness and even the ultimate reality, the Shabda Brahman. Now, does thought depend on language? This is a common question that has often been asked in philosophy. Bhartrihari has no doubts at all regarding that. Nasosti pratyayo lokeya shabdanugamad. There is shabdanugamad hruday. Without shabda, there cannot be anything. We cannot have any reality. There's no cognition without the operation of the word. All knowledge is illuminated by the word. Taking hint from the Paninian rule, Swam Rupam Shabdasya Ashabda Sapnya. Shabdasya Ashabda Sapnya. Swam Rupam Shabdasya Ashabda Sapnya. It's hard to read the English. Bhartrihari, so wherein it says that the word not only has phonetic representation, it also has its sense. Bhartrihari developed the idea of twofold meaning of a word, its phonetic form and its meaning, that is sense. This is comparable to both knowledge and light. See, knowledge is twofold. On one side, there is the object, and on the other, there is the knowledge of the object. Similarly, light. A light also has twofold feature. On one, it is on its own that it reveals. It just exists, and it also has the potency to revealing the other. However, it is a sentence, not the word, which is the basic unit of language. Meaning is understood holistically through spota, which is the mental burst of the entire sentence's meaning, rather than by combining individual words' meaning. When a speaker utters sounds or dhwani, they die away in the next moment, revealing the spota, which is an auditory impression of the sound. Immediately, the pratibha as flash translates the impression of the sound into meaning. Now, the gap between the flash and the understanding of a sentence meaning is not noticeable. Due to this, people think that they are identical. According to Bhartrihari, the sole purpose of speech is to help someone express his own self. Now, this is the crux of it. What is the purpose of speech? The purpose of the speech is to express, reveal oneself. And this desire for self-expression is indivisible into any parts. We reach words as parts of the sentence through analysis, synthesis, and abstraction, which is all a method of language learning. The meaning of a word in isolation is an imaginary construct. There is no rat in Socrates. The wholes may have parts, but such parts lose their significance as soon as they lose their contextuality in the whole. The parts get assumed in the whole and therefore becomes non-identifiable. He even goes to the extent of saying that words are only abstracted meaning possibilities, whereas the uttered sentence is the realization of a meaning whole, irreducible to those parts in themselves. Don't miss out the clear Buddhist influence visible here. I have to speak a lot on this, but probably during the discussion. Quite like the word construction denoting particulars, the Shabda at the word level is only our Vikalpa. The resonances of Jackendorf's parallel architecture model is well heard in this theory, I suppose. His idea of placing phonetic syntax and semantics as independent generative components with its coherent function constraint, with its coherent which function constraint based is brought out more beautifully in this theory rather than in conceptual semantics, I suppose. Although some assumptions of Goldberg, who's a cognitive linguist, attested by Jackendorf, such as semantics is based on the speaker's construal of situations, not on objective truth conditions, sound familiar to a Bhartrahari scholar. For here, Vakyapadiya famously says, I'll read out the Vakyapadiya, Pradeshasya ekadesham va pardo va nirupanam viparyayam abhavam va vyavaharo anuvartade. See, it is not the case that a language represents the world. Verbal usage may follow only one aspect of reality, at times even reversal, viparyaya, just the reversal of the reality or something non-existent, abhava. A word is based on a cognition which does not reflect its object in its entirety. Further linguistic utterances do not represent the object as it is, says Vakipadiya. He says, Talava drishyade vyoma, the sky appears as if it is a plate, as a surface. Khadyodo khavyavad iva. Nachasti talam vyomni na khadyode udashanaha. There is neither a concrete surface in the sky, nor there is fire in the firefly, because so despite we speak about it. Again, even the same person may perceive the same thing differently at different times. Egasminnavi drishyarthe darshanam vidyade pridhak. Even in the one single object, you may see different things at different times. And so is the case. So it goes on saying, Vakyapadya says that objects have no intrinsic nature. It is the use that determines the nature of the object because the object has all capacities. Also, words like Shashashringa, Khaburusha, so on and so forth reveal that words not only present an incomplete picture of reality, it also conveys non-reality. So this lack of necessary and direct correspondence gives a certain freedom to the speaker, vivaksha, in representing a thing as he wants. Another assumption implicit in conceptual semantics that semantics and pragmatics form a continuum and both play a role in linguistic meaning has great resonance in Vakyapadiya. For instance, famously it is said that Kagebhyo rakshadam sarpiridi balobi choditaha. When the boy is asked to preserve the butter from crows, he needn't be separately told that he should also protect it from dogs and other animals. This is the pragmatic extension of cognition, a linguistic expression. So Bhartrahari enlists 14 contextual factors to draw fresh meanings in different pragmatic contexts, such as samsarga, viprayoga, sahajarya, so on. So when Bhartrahari rejects the presence of a structure given beforehand. On the contrary, he denies the reality of elements that should be central in supposed structure in language. He says, just as there is Brahmanardho yadha nasti kastit Brahmana Gambale. In what you call Brahmana Gambala, there is no Brahmana that has been mentioned. So it's the case with Ashwashringa. There is a leaf called. So there is no Ashwa in that. So there is no separate meaning that can be accounted for the words in the sentence. That is the argument. Further, words and sentences can be analyzed and explained in several ways, and hence the parts used to explain the whole have no definitive status. So, in brief, I feel Bhartrhari's theory of spota and the idea of speech manifesting from inner to outer levels, you know that he speaks about three levels, Pashyandi, Madhyama, and Vaikhari, are central to his cognitive approach to language. And the detailed analysis on the inner working, the inner structuring of the language makes him a precursor to modern cognitive linguistics. Now I read out a quotation from Jack and Duff, but you will almost read it as that of Bhartrhari. I quote, I maintain that a theory of meaning must pertain to the behavioral reality of the organism, not to the physical reality, to the world as it appears to organism, or more properly, the world as it is constructed by the organism's mind. Who has said this? Is it Jack and Duff or Bhartrhari? There with the Vyakarana and then move to Swatantra Vijnana Vada. I'll just take 5 minutes or so. So the Buddhist perspective that the world is not as it appears necessitates a deeper examination of the self and its experimental reality. This inquiry naturally extends to key areas, the function of language and representation and the methods for transcending illusion to attain true knowledge. Now, the proponents of Swatantra Vijnanavada, particularly Dinnaga and Dharmakirti, emphasize on the immediate experiential perception, free from linguistic constructs, rejecting generality and class concepts as mental concepts, an orientation that resonates well with the embodied theories. So in this, we will have two goals. First, to isolate the embodied features in Swatantra Vijnanavada and also account for their semantics. First, let us see how the Swatantra Vijnanavada accounts for embodied theory. For that, we'll have to explore Buddhist theory of cognition. Buddhist cognitive theory embraces a causal model of perception where knowledge arises due to specific conditions rather than through a correspondence with an external, independently existing reality. In other words, cognition, be it perception or inference, is not a self-contained entity, but emerges in a dynamic causal way, pratitya samutpanna. By grounding cognition in impermanence and dependent origination, Buddhist thought offers a framework where knowing is an ever-evolving process rather than a static representation of an absolute world. Dinnaga in Pramana Samuchaya says that there are two categories of knowable objects. Prameya are of two types, Swalakshana and Samanya Lakshana. While perception is a direct and non-conceptual experience of particulars, inference attends to what is called the Samanya Lakshana. In perception, Dinnaga highlights the distinction between immediate sensation and the conceptual part of it, where judgment is involved. At the stage of conceptualization, we are taken to a similar object because it's fleeting. The reality, since reality is fleeting, at the time of conceptualization, we are taken to a similar object belonging to the same class as the one we experience in the sensation. This in turn reveals the dynamism inherent in perceptual process. It is not merely a passive reception of stimuli, but an active, dynamic process shaped by bodily interactions with the world. Dharmakirti asserts, which is definitely an embodied theory. Dharmakirti asserts that knowledge is validated not by correspondence with external reality, since for them the external world is transient, but with the help of coherence, where the cognitive agent looks for a coherence between the earlier sensation that he experienced and the other things in the series with which the sensation coheres. So knowledge, therefore, is neither intrinsically true nor erroneous. It becomes reliable only by the subsequent operation of the mind, which puts up a test of efficacy to it. This is what is called the Arthakriya Samarthya. I skip this. Dharmakirti also speaks about the 4 stages of perception, where the mental perception and the Swasamvedana are very significant. See, when the Buddhists speak about the Swasamvedana, it also has leanings towards embodied theory. So when you speak about Swasamvedana or metacognition, what they do is they try to retain our cognition at the preconceptual level with the embodied and the subjective aspect of cognition, restricting the what is called the internal exercises or conceptualization. The idea is that mindfulness practices enhance or enliven our reflexive awareness, heightening our sensitivity to what Malaponte calls the phenomenal field of the lived body. I'll skip some of this because, and therefore, Mm, Buddhist theory of cognition aligns with embodied cognition because cognition is situated and context dependent, it's time pressured and action oriented. Cognitive processes are offloaded onto the environment, and cognition and environment form an integrated system. Now, the play of science. See, Buddhists speak about science, and language definitely is a sign. When is it that cognition moves to sign? At the level of conceptualization. So both perception and inference involve science. Um, Inference from the start involves linguistic science, while perception only at the second level involves linguistic science. So for Swatantra Vijnanavadan, every object is a sign, and the ultimate goal for them, and even for all schools of Buddhism for that matter, is to transcend these signs and attain the state of nirvana, which is a stage of signlessness. When perception moves to conceptualization, you have a representational knowledge, which in fact is distancing oneself from the truth. But despite this, the Naga acknowledge the role of language in our Vyavaharika level. For them, the meaning of a word is not a positive reference to a universal, but a negative one, which is called Anya Apoha. By excluding the other, it's called the Apoha Avada. For example, the word cow does not refer to a universal cowness, but rather eliminates the non-cows from consideration. So this conceptual elimination is one tool of linguistic representation, and the other tool to ground meaning is the vasana, imprint in our cognition. Now, this is the innate faculty, because here Dharmakirti speaks about two imprints, the experiential and the innate imprints. The innate imprints are residing in our alaya vijnana, which are brought from our early births, the vasanas, and that is why we have even language. All this can be accounted in this innate imprints as infants due to innate disposition. So this is the storehouse consciousness, and thus Buddhist semiotics identifies the role of language as one distancing us from direct reality, but indispensable for communication, cognition, and pragmatic engagement with the world. However, this very reliance on linguistic science traps being within a representational framework, reinforcing conceptual proliferation, what is called prapancha, which is a source of suffering. Thank you. I wind up.